Well, hello everyone. This is Daniel here with the SOLA Network, and here I am with Josh Shek. And I'm going to have you introduce yourself, Josh. Can you tell us what you do and what you've been involved in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, well, thanks, Dan, for having me on Solar to be interviewed. It's great to be here. So I am a British-born Chinese. I was born and raised here in the city of Portsmouth, and I'm currently living in Milton Keynes. And my ministry in the UK for the last 10 or so years was mostly with an organization called the Chinese Overseas Christian Mission. So they're kind of like the main charity working with different Chinese churches, different Chinese communities across the whole of UK and Europe right now as well, doing what was previously lots of church planting, and now they're kind of moving into a phase where they're doing more work supporting churches and things like leadership development, training, leading different mission trips around the continent as well. So most of my work across that 10 years has been focused upon with the second generation. So British-born Chinese, British-raised Chinese like myself, working around their discipleship, their leadership. And a lot of that work has been basically around organizing and running conferences. So whereas you've got all these like youth groups and fledgling English ministries around the country, a lot of my work has then been to try to connect those ministries together, bring different leaders together, trying to gather all these different scattered groups and then connecting them to leaders that we can then provide training on a kind of more mass scale. So yeah, leadership development, discipleship training, and now branching out into a little bit more into theological spheres as well. So right now, I'm actually working directly with COCM, but I've just handed in my master's thesis looking into the doctrine of adoption, trying to understand how does it provide a slightly more familial theme or familial language around our ideas and understanding of how we're saved by Jesus. And the idea behind that is that I want to then move into hopefully doctoral studies where I can start to apply some of that thinking and hopefully see where we can understand even theology from a more, let's say, Chinese or Asian perspective in its more naturally collectivistic or familial grounds or perspectives. So the idea is to try to develop a slightly more grassroots understanding of salvation using slightly less Western or non-traditionally Western ideas and looking at it from a more perhaps naturally Asian perspective instead.
Wow, that's fantastic, Josh. I'd love to hear more about your PhD research aspirations, but I want to hear more about the work that you have been doing with the Chinese churches in the UK. Can you tell me, like, can we just talk about how did Chinese people end up in the UK in the first place?
Right. So I think the history of it, I mean, the earliest kind of like significant movement of Chinese into the UK was actually in like the 1940s. And that's where you had like several thousand, mostly Chinese men from places like Shanghai, Hong Kong, naturally, and places like Singapore, Malaysia, coming to the UK and actually getting involved with the war effort. So like the earliest kind of documented evidence is you get these sailors coming to port cities, especially places like Liverpool in the northwest, where they were helping out with the merchant navy in that war effort. So that was kind of like the earliest mass migration. Then like through the 50s, 60s, all the way through to the 80s is then when you start to see more and more Hong Kongese migrate to the UK because it was still part of the Commonwealth back then, so it was much easier to migrate over, and that includes my parents' generation as well. So my parents, they came over in the 80s, and kind of like a similar story to the North American migration motivation, I guess. So it's still for economic reasons, for future generational caretaking reasons. So a lot of like restaurant and takeaway industry workers back then. So same for myself as well. I was born to a takeaway family and grew up in my teenage years in that kind of catering environment as well.
So when you say takeaway, you're talking about a restaurant.
When I say takeaway, I mean takeaway. So
Okay.
different to a restaurant. So there's no sit down tables. It's literally just a counter. You order at the counter, they cook the food in the back, and then you take it away in the bag.
Okay, we call that a takeout in the US.
I'll take out, right. So take out, take away. Yeah.
Yeah. Go on, go on.
Yeah. So that kind of like formed the majority of the basis of the Chinese in Britain, essentially. So like overwhelmingly Hong Kongese, Cantonese speaking, in all the major cities and towns throughout the UK. And so that's where you start to see the formations of all these fellowships, Christian fellowships, starting to appear. So alongside like the catering industry starting to develop in the UK, then in like the 80s and 90s, 70s and 80s and 90s as well, you then see a lot of students from Hong Kong coming to the UK to study and then staying here to carry on working as professionals as well. Into the 90s, then when you start to see not just Hong Kongese professionals, but also intellectuals from mainland China
Mm.
come to the UK and do a similar thing. They settle, find work over here, and start families over here as well. So that was kind of the environment in my teenage through to like early years. You get this mix where the Chinese church is still predominantly Cantonese speaking, but with then a sudden movement of Mandarin speaking
Yes.
families coming in, as well as the second generation. So the English speaking British born Chinese and British raised Chinese coming through the church. And then most recently, I guess, has been what we're probably familiar with, like what's happened in Hong Kong has resulted in the UK opening up the British National Overseas visa route into the UK. So in, I think it was February 2021, the UK allowed anyone with a BNO passport to come to the UK quite easily. And since then, we've had around somewhere between 120 to 140,000
Wow.
new Hong Kongese migrants come into the UK. And I think they're right now, they're projecting that by the end of this year, it's going to look somewhere around the 150 to 180,000 total new migrants that moved in. And considering that before all that happened, the total UK Chinese population was only around maybe 400,000, excluding like full-time international students. That's been a massive change to the demographic and to like the subcultural landscape of the Chinese that we've had in the UK.
Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like not only has it shifted in terms of where the migrants are from, but then also vocationally too, because you mentioned a lot of them were takeaway workers first, and then you have students and some more who are uh, marketplace leaders coming through, especially some Mandarin speaking, and then we're starting to see away from Hong Kong again, and this sounds like it's not the same kind of immigrant that was staffing the takeaways earlier too.
Yeah, absolutely. So early on, you get this, the only kind of dichotomy, or I guess this mix of different groups was the takeaway workers. So the blue collar catering trade, not necessarily as highly educated as their peers. So that was like the very, very early waves, economic migrants. Then and they were then mixing with the professionals, the university students, the scholars who then settled here for jobs. So that was kind of like the mix. And you saw that across the board, whether that's inside the church or outside the church, you just get this mix of people who are either in white collar jobs, so highly professional, highly educated, or blue collar catering trade. But mostly again, still from a Hong Kongese background. So at least culturally and in terms of their heritage, in terms of where they've come from, that was the same. That then shifted, like you added a new paradigm in there when you had the Mandarin speaking professionals come in, and then of course it shifted again when most recently you've then got the new BNO families that are coming over. And for the most part, like that's not necessarily economic migration. A lot of that might be down to like political ideology or political differences, both within their own family, but of course with what's going on in Hong Kong as well. But then when you bring that group into the context that was here in the UK, where you've then got not just churches, but the entire country, where you've got so much of already a mixture of people who have come from mainland China or have come from places like Taiwan, Singapore, and again, mostly from Hong Kong to the UK, then the way that that's created new dynamics in this country has definitely been something to navigate, both again inside the church and outside the church, especially like with the first generation of migrants coming from Hong Kong who maybe didn't have such strong views about what's going on in Hong Kong because of Chinese influences or such, which I don't want to get into too much because I don't want to politicize this too much, I guess. But you can kind of get this idea that the differences at that point aren't that go beyond the economic, but they might go into the political, they go into the linguistic, they go into the socioeconomic in that sense as well. So lots of different dynamics happening here.
Mm-hmm. With this, even with the spectrum of where they're from and what kind of jobs they have, what are some common experiences you would say that Chinese in the UK have, like, British Chinese?
Right. I think for the most part, like when the total Chinese community in the UK and its relationships to the UK in general, it's probably quite similar. So those differences are kind of more internally facing within the different Chinese, ethnically Chinese groups within the UK. But as British Chinese existing in the UK, I think for the most part, the struggle is, of course, still a lot of it is still socioeconomic, and especially for the working generation, like how do they get into jobs? How do they qualify with degrees or whatever it is that they need to actually access work? So, and part of it is kind of the ethnic discussion. I think one difference that I can observe, having spoken to some people that have come from North America, whether that's Canada or the US to the UK, the difference between their experience and our experiences in the UK is that it seems like the US is a little bit more racially cohesive. There's a lot more diversity, but there's also a lot more racial acceptance in that diversity as well.
That
And
might
whilst
surprise some of our listeners, by the way, but keep going.
okay, well, at least that's that. I get maybe it's more of a relative thing. So in the
Yeah.
UK, I think our perceptions of where we stand as a minority ethnicity group in the UK is that we don't feel that the UK is as much of a melting pot. It actually, it's in terms of like the proportions, there's still a significant number of minority ethnic groups in the UK, but the UK still very much feels like it's a not just predominantly white dominated in terms of the numbers of people that are there, but even culturally, there isn't as much of a dialogue, as much of an engagement in kind of like the racial discussion or the ethnic discussion is there. It is happening, but I think relative to the US, it's not as open and there's not as much dialogue as there is perhaps in the US, which might be a surprise, but certainly with things like COVID and the kind of the way that the Chinese were portrayed through that over here, we felt that like even more. And what's interesting is that with the UK, I think one aspect of British culture is this idea of being reserved, of privacy is kind of like a central British value, right? But then when you bring privacy and reservation into as a context, and you bring Chinese people who are already quite reserved, like we have this idea where like you don't cause trouble, especially if you're an immigrant. You feel like there's that kind of either that guest mentality or just don't stir the pot. Like you're trying to settle and to be successful economically and socially, yet you don't want to break into that because then you're invading someone's privacy at that point as well. So I think the way that race gets understood around here, in perhaps more of a subconscious kind of way, is that you don't talk about race. And so how do you then engage with that when you're a minority and trying to succeed in that kind of environment, whether that's as a first generational migrant or as a second generational child trying to grow up in that environment as well? So I think that kind of like gives an idea of some of the challenges that come through when we're talking about how do the Chinese as an ethnic group try to settle in. But I think for the most part, though, what I've seen is that most Chinese do succeed. So the educational, the political openness and opportunities that exist here have actually meant that I've seen lots of people and our group in general kind of do pretty well. Like we get the grades, the work ethic allows us to succeed inside industry. The bigger question then comes down to, well, then how do I integrate myself into wider British culture in terms of its practice, in terms of its media consumption? And that's where you then really start to see the differences. So I think, again, whilst the US then sees that integration or that blending of different cultures coming through, in the UK, we don't really see that as much as well. Part of that, I think, also comes down to the slightly more, again, relatively homogenistic understanding of what the British Chinese really looks like. It's predominantly Hong Kong based with now a significant body of Mandarin speakers, but we don't have as much of a mix between the different Confucian cultures that you might see in the US. So whereas in the US, we might talk about Asian American ministries or Asian American communities, where you've then got that blend of Hong Kong background, Taiwanese background, Korean background, Japanese background, and lots of other places.
Yeah.
In the UK, when we say Chinese, we predominantly mean Hong Kongese, a little bit of mainland Chinese, and a spattering of others. So like there's maybe perhaps a handful of Korean churches around the country. There's a spattering of Taiwanese churches around the country. But again, predominantly it's going to be from that Cantonese and maybe a little bit of Mandarin, not a little bit, quite a significant body now of Mandarin speaking communities around as well. But because it's a lot more homogenous in that sense, there's a lot more ability for us to kind of create our own pockets of communities where we feel safest.
Right.
And
right.
so the differences between us and the native English or the Brits is much wider. And we're not kind of trained to even work out, okay, how do we bridge these differences internally between the different Chinese groups that exist around, or Asian groups that exist.
Josh, you mentioned earlier about fellowships that form, and you mentioned briefly about churches. And so you've also talked about how the experience is for British Chinese and some British born Chinese as well. Can you tell me about how churches are reaching folks and discipling them?
So churches so far, I mean, what's interesting about the UK is that because the numbers of Chinese in the UK is actually so small. Like I mentioned before, that once you add in the most recent Hong Kongese migration as well, you're looking at around maybe 500,000 of like stable long-term Chinese in the UK. And that's actually a really small number relative to the rest of the UK population. So we only make up about 1% of the entire UK population. But as a result, what's happened is that you'll only really find one, maybe two, maybe three Chinese churches or fellowships in any town or city. Obviously, like London and the big cities like Birmingham, Manchester, you'll see more. So London's got dozens, Birmingham's got about 3 or 4, Manchester's got about 2, 3 or 4 as well. Everywhere else, you can kind of expect there's only going to be one Christian group, maybe 2, as a fellowship or a church.
Like a Bible study. It doesn't have to
precisely.
be right.
Yeah. So it might be like a university students' Bible study that's on campus, and then you've got a church who, and that group they might rent out the local Baptist church's building on a Sunday. So that's still very much the practice over here. So one of the kind of immediate context is that, well, you don't have the numbers to reach out. So how do you then bring in all these people? And again, thinking about the idea of just like the British reservation as well as the Chinese reservation, what we find is that a lot of these Chinese communities are essentially just like these little clans of people who all move together from, whether it's Hong Kong or China or anywhere else. They come to the UK, they go to where their friends are in the first place, and then they stick to themselves. So you never hear about them. Even as other Chinese, you know that they're out there somewhere, but you don't know where they are. Part of that was also the way that the takeaway industry kind of dispersed everyone. So there's kind of like this kind of bigger idea where when you come to the UK and you decide to start your own takeaway or restaurant business, well, you'll make sure that you don't set up that business anywhere too close to where your nearest competitor is. And then so naturally over time, you get all these thousands of different small businesses being created around like 2-3 miles away from each other. And that spread us all out, but it's also meant that we're not in very, very close contact with each other. They are, so that you get these pockets where these networks all know each other. But then when you apply that network onto the context of the church, you either know someone in the church or you have very, very little idea of what's going on. So in terms of like an evangelistic kind of routine, it was harder for the earlier Chinese Christians in the UK to reach out. There were a few programs. So COCM, the organization I was with, a lot of its work was to try to evangelize to all the different Chinese that were spread out. One of the big things that COCM and a different organization tried to do was to basically establish kind of like a restaurant workers ministry. So it specifically tried to tap into that network of catering workers, evangelized them, brought them into the church, and then that's where you see a kind of like a new community start to form around that kind of spiritual community that was there. So that's kind of like the context that I was raised in, like where half of the adults in the church were catering background, the other half were students, and so now what we see is all of these individual churches, again, just the 1 or 2 in any major city or town, trying to reach out and it finds that difficult. Like, how do you reach out to a group that has hidden itself away so well? And when your own resources are already so low within your own churches, so you don't really see that many professional ministers. So we're talking like full-time pastors. We don't, of course, they exist in our churches, but the proportional number of them in the UK, just given how much smaller our churches are, much more smaller. A lot of church workers, if they were trained out in Asia, may have come to the US. Very few of them, relatively speaking, have come to the UK and to Europe. So in terms of like even just the number of professional ministers that we have access to and can like spearhead a lot of that work, much less. We rely a lot more in terms of like lay leadership. So leaders that God has raised up locally to do whatever it is, whether it's pastoring, teaching, preaching, disciple making. It's a lot more family orientated. And so I don't just mean that in terms of like the cultural context, but a lot of the churches here are just collections of close-knit families. So the entire kind of mode of church life is very familial. So I think that's one advantage. Whereas the UK, the small numbers actually means that you know everyone in your church. If it's a Chinese church, you know the 4 or 5 families that are there. It might be more, but it's this idea where as a church culture, everything kind of revolves in a very much like a tribal kind of way. The preaching, the teaching, the disciple making happens within a context that is incredibly familial in that sense. And that's good in many ways. Like it grounds our faith life, it grounds our discipleship in ways that are very much concrete. And so we apply a lot of that faith expression within the church context as a spiritual family in that sense, and then that allows us to then bring that out into our workplaces, our schools. But I'd say like that's still then one of the biggest challenges. Like, how do you do that in ways that are going to be effective and long term when it's so familial and it's so short term in the sense of it's almost it's week to week rather than having a long term worker there that's thinking far ahead into the future. I'm painting more of a general picture because I think we still see, like in the big cities like London, Manchester, Birmingham, where there are resources at every level, whether that's in the different language ministries, Cantonese, Mandarin, English, and at different generations as well. So there are some places that have youth workers, most places don't have youth workers. Some places have English ministry pastors. Again, the overwhelming majority of them do not have English ministry workers in their churches. So where those resources do exist, those churches then look a lot more stable. They actually have programs, they actually have workshops, they're able to teach a lot more far-reaching, longer thinking kind of things. Whereas in most places though, you're still basically trying to get by week to week. You're seeing all of these inorganic changes happening to your demographic, all these new families coming into your context, and you're just reacting to it rather than being able to plan for long-term discipleship in that sense.
Wow. You mentioned briefly about how do you reach them in a way that they understand. You also mentioned about your PhD research. Can you talk more about that in terms of how do we reach British Chinese in a way that resonates with them?
I think that certainly in my own church experience, growing up in a fairly small Chinese Christian fellowship, church for me, or let's say Christianity for me, was very much a concrete experience. Like growing up as one of only 2 Asians in my secondary school or high school, the school environment, like the Western environment, was one that was hard to connect with. It's one that I wanted to integrate with, but I found a lot more comfort. I found a lot more acceptance within the Chinese church as a community. And so when it comes to understanding what it means to be a Christian, I think what the British Chinese church has done very successfully is that it's managed to create a context where that kind of like transform community, that transform family is something that we live. It's not just something that we preach about. It's not just something that we talk about. It's not just something that's abstract, but it's concretely experienced and worked out. Obviously, there's lots of like cultural baggage that comes with that sometimes. And I think both the UK and the US is trying to work out how do we leave the cultural baggage behind and try to keep the parts about being Asian and being collectivistic that's that aligns with kingdom values and kingdom expressions of what it means to be a community. But what the UK has done really, really well, or maybe not, and perhaps not consciously, and that's where I think the UK Chinese Church, again, because of that slightly more limited scale and that slightly more organic growth of community, rather than one that's being driven very much by programs and more just by normal societal needs, normal needs of migrant families coming to a new place. It creates that kind of dynamic relationship where we feel like we belong within the Chinese Church.
Right.
And it also creates an environment where the ideas of familial belonging are very, very much central to it. So I think what's interesting is how the British Chinese Church can provide a lived experience of Christianity that is centrally familial, is centrally collectivistic in that kind of way. And it provides a different Christian narrative and context to what we're seeing happening to the majority white Anglican Baptist Methodist church in the UK, where a lot of it is traditionally very individualistic. A lot of discipleship for that context is orientated around preaching, around dogmatics, around theology. It's around an intellectual understanding and grasp of our faith. Mm-hmm. And that's great. But that's then not transferring and transforming into a collectivist, like a familial understanding and practice of faith. And that's something that I think that the British Chinese Church does really well, again, very organically. It's not as good at that point in terms of the theology, in terms of its biblical understanding, its biblical literacy. But that's where I then think that there's an opportunity for the British-born Chinese and for the second and third generations beyond that to really take the opportunity to be that bridge between those two cultures. Like, how do we, as British-born Chinese, take the way that our Western educational influences have shaped our ability to critique the Bible, to understand a biblical theology in a way that actually grounds our understanding, our rationality of our faith, but at the same time, allow that to be shaped by and inform our actual expression of the church as a family. Yeah. So this idea where we call each other brothers and sisters, it's not just something that's sentimental, but within the gospel, apparently that's a reality that happens because of what Jesus has done on the cross. And like when I grew up in the church, like I call the people around me aunties and uncles, and right. Somehow right. That is like this cultural expression. It's a Chinese expression of a deeper kingdom expression of being brothers and sisters around that. So I think there's something to be said about how being British Chinese, and I think Asian American as well, can start to, or eventually, I think you guys are doing already, but for us over here, I think we're still trying to work out what does it mean to be the British Chinese Church within going into the second and third generations, and what advantages does that have in terms of being able to bridge between the different Chinese subgroups that we see over here, as well as bridging between a Western way of approaching discipleship and faith and a Chinese way of approaching discipleship and churchmanship and ecclesiology and eventually missiology as well.
Well, I'm grateful to hear about your desire to see progress happen and how to reach British Chinese, especially you yourself as a British-born Chinese. By the way, I really like how you say British-born Chinese, the kind of the way we say American-born Chinese, ABC here, but BBC means something different over there too. And so,
right.
How can we pray? You know, what are the needs? How can we pray for the Chinese in the UK?
Right. So there's the obvious ones, like we're lacking resources. Like I mentioned that concept of we don't have that many pastors over here, and that even extends into like the next generations as well. I think there's something about the fact that we are in that phase of our migration story in history where at the second generation, like me and my peers, I mean, I'm of course an exception. I went into full-time ministry, but many of my peers are second generational migrants, stuck it out with university, got into good jobs, in order to honor like that first generational sacrifice to come over here to work hard, to provide for our education. And as a result, there's, I think, at least sociologically, less of an inclination for people from my generation to go into full-time ministry. So certainly for maybe not as much in the first generation, but certainly for the second generation, you see very much a lack of full-time workers right now. Like there's, I know all of them, and like you can probably count them all on two hands and 2 feet. That's how many there are in the entire country in that sense. So certainly do pray for God to raise more leaders in the UK. But I think one interesting way to approach that is one way I'm trying to understand how Christian ministry and leadership in the UK might occur in the UK is perhaps maybe not so much through a professional pastorate. I think one aspect of what's happened within both the US and the UK is that kind of our concepts of pastoral ministry have now become really inflated. Like pastors, certainly in the UK anyway, like they're expected to be at least bilingual, if not trilingual. Like you have to speak English and Cantonese and Mandarin, so you're able to maybe not minister fully, but at least understand and interact well with all 3 languages. There's an expectation where you're both a theologian and also a really good pastor, so you can preach and you can do the house visitations. You've got a background in youth work, and you can also do worship ministry as well. So I think one other aspect of what's stopping so many people from going into full-time ministry is that those expectations of ministry are now just so high, and the pay is so low. So like, how do you reconcile that when you've already got this cultural pressure to succeed economically and financially in your career, and there may be a desire to get involved with church work, but the demands of it seem so huge before you get into it? So I wonder whether what God might be doing in the UK is to do a little bit of a reset in terms of what our conceptions of what Christian work looks like, where it doesn't have to be professional, it doesn't have to be full-time and paid by the church solely, but there can be there might be more of a familial way of approaching that ministry, because the numbers again are so small, where you may not have all the finances to be able to provide for full-time ministers in that kind of way. But then how can churches across the country, no matter what size they are, whether they're in just like the 30s, 40s, 50s, or all the way up to the 150s, 200s, to start to approach ministry, especially at the second generational British Chinese level, that uses a more of a team approach to ministry.
Right.
So you encourage not necessarily pastors, capital P, to get involved in the work of pastoral ministry, but you encourage people with a pastoral small p gifting to get involved in that through their Bible study groups, their home groups, their life groups. And you're also then encouraging those who have got of a teaching ability, who have got more of an inclination towards theology, to be getting involved in that. So that's where, for me, even for myself, I've chosen to go down a slightly more of a theological research kind of route, because my personal aim is that I want to enable and empower the next generation of leaders to come through without having to worry too much about theologizing for the British Chinese Church, and they can then focus on the work of the local ministry. And I think that's going to be something that's particular to the UK. How can we carry on praying for the development of local ministries in ways that are organic, despite all the inorganic demographic changes that have happened, to the point where the English speaking, so the second, third, fourth generational communities that will form the backbone of the emerging British Chinese Church, be able to sustain a multi-generational and future-facing ministry that is able to take the advantage, to leverage the advantages that is available to it because of its particular position as being bicultural, as being able to understand ministry from a more familial kind of approach. And so I think that hopefully gives an idea of one of the ways that I think we can be praying for the British Chinese Church, for more people to be encouraged and be called by God to go into Christian ministry, but not necessarily have to do it in a very professional kind of way. So, and I think that's going to be something that's necessary. But I think even before that, one of the biggest prayer request that we can make over here is in terms of discipleship of the BBCs, so the second generation migrants here in the UK, because the resources are so lacking, because the programs, the churches over here haven't worked out yet how to engage in effective evangelism, how to engage in effective disciple making yet. And a lot of it is still basically just importing a Western program of disciple making and Bible study focus in our churches. There's still, I think I'm still hoping to see a deepening sense of personal devotion, personal faith amongst the majority of the individuals that go to the churches that I'm involved with. So how can our churches develop bigger ideas of not just bigger ideas, but more effective, more holistic ideas of disciple making that take into account both of their cultural heritages, that help them understand that their position as bicultural is actually an advantage and not something to escape from one way or the other. And eventually, through that personal discipleship, to then become leaders in their own churches as well. So I think, yeah, personal discipleship, personal devotion, personal faith. It sounds very simple, but I think it's something that I'm praying for, and I'd love prayer from my cousins elsewhere in the world for our churches in the UK.
Well, Josh Shek, thank you so much for the time that we've had together. I'm encouraged by the work that you're doing and the work that you have done with the Chinese churches in the UK. And I mean, God really bless your research. And thanks for sharing with us how we can pray for our brothers and sisters overseas. Thanks a lot, Josh.
Thank you.